In the discussion between balanced versus unbalanced lines, let's start off with the easy one, which is unbalanced, your typical guitar cable, where you have two paths. Your tip is your hot path, and then your sleeve is your ground path. So down the hot path, we're going to be sending a signal from your source, and that'll be something like a microphone or a guitar pickup, and that will make its way from the source to your input, which might be something like, say, a guitar amp or the input channel on a mixer. So that's the intended signal that we want to go down that path. But unfortunately, cables tend to act kind of like antennas, and they can pick up all sorts of RF junk. And so that's what's represented here on the screen. If that goes down the same line, it wasn't transmitted from the source, but it's been picked up along that cable, then what comes out the other end is our original signal plus all that junk. And because the original source is quite often low level, like microphones don't put out a lot of level, certainly pickups don't put out a lot of level, then we'll need to gain that up. And when we gain that all up, all that noise will come along for the ride. So like they say in all the infomercials, there's got to be a better way, and there is. And they are balanced lines. So a balanced line looks like this, your typical mic cable with XLR connectors on the end. And the interesting thing about XLR connectors is that they have three paths. So three paths versus two paths. What's the big deal there? Well, if we look at pin number 2, that is our hot path. That's exactly like we had before. Our signal's going down there. Everything looks normal up at this point compared to our unbalanced line. But there is another path here called the cold path on pin number 3. And the special thing about the cold path is it sends a copy of that same signal down there, but it flips it 180 degrees out of phase. And the reasons for that we'll be able to discover in a second. But just for now, know that now there's two copies of that signal going down that balanced line. One is the original signal on the hot path, and the other one is a flipped version of that along the cold path. And then pin number 1 is your ground. So let's see what happens when we start introducing RF to this line. So RF comes down the hot line, and guess what? It comes down the cold line as well. So now you might be thinking, gosh, now I have twice the problems. I have twice the amount of noise coming down here. But here's where the whole flipping thing works out really well for us. Now, at the input, we then flip that backwards on the cold path. So we basically flip that backwards, and here's what happens to our original signal and our noise. They both get flipped backwards. And so what happens when you add that to your hot path, you have your original signal plus that flipped version. You basically have just a slightly hotter version of that original signal. Because that original signal that's coming down on the cold path has been flipped once at the source and then flipped again at the input, it basically flips it around 360 degrees and just basically adds those together for a slightly hotter version of that signal. If we hadn't flipped it back at the input, then they would have completely canceled each other out. Now, check out what happens with that original noise on the hot path plus the flipped version of that noise. Guess what that'll do? Bang! Completely cancels each other out. That's the reason that we want to flip at the source and then at the input, because it flips the original signal once and then twice, which is great. Everything is good in there, but it flips that noise that's coming down and cancels each other out. And then so all you're left with is just your original signal. Now, by the way, apart from XLR connectors, you can also have balanced lines down 1/4-inch jacks like this, but they have 3 paths as well. Instead of it just being a tip and sleeve, they have a tip, which is the hot path, a ring, which is the cold path, and then the sleeve, which is a ground path. So think of balanced lines as your trusted shelter from all that, the RF interference that's just floating around everywhere and every day. there are new gadgets that emit RF. So get your signal down a balanced line as soon as you possibly can. If your guitar is going to a DI box, which then plugs into a balanced line, let that unbalanced cable, that guitar cable, be as short as possible. Why use a 20-footer when you can use a 10-footer? Get it to the safety of that DI box and that balanced line as soon as you can. Also, don't skimp on cables and buy crappy ones. Stick to the better ones like Megami and Canare because they have better shielding.